Thanks for having me, everyone. This week has been such an intellectual buffet. It's been so fun to learn about all of your research and so many disciplinary perspectives on high-dimensional traces of behavior. Today I'm going to talk about my favorite high-dimensional behaviors, which are large-scale social phenomena. And to start off, biographical details. I'm an assistant professor of psychology at Princeton. Nice to meet you. To start off, I wanted to say a little bit about my research program. Broadly, my lab studies how humans collaborate, and this is kind of an evergreen question about what it means to be human. Collaboration is a key part of our ecological niche, but it's particularly urgent to examine how we work together today because the past century has completely transformed how we collaborate. So scientific teams have surpassed lone authors as the main drivers of scientific production. Organizations have become increasingly stratified into teams. And this societal transition into more complex and intensive forms of collaboration is the key driving force behind some of the main cultural and intellectual achievements of our time, from movies to moon landings. But it's also created problems that we don't face when we work alone. For example, our collaborators can refuse to respond to our messages. They can slack off. We can disagree bitterly over different visions and claims for credit. And so in order to understand what makes collaboration so powerful and also how collaborations can go wrong, my lab studies the basic computational problems that are faced by teams in the ways that cognitive scientists have traditionally studied the basic computational problems faced by individual minds. Now, the idea that teams function as information processing systems, basically forming a mind of their own, is actually as old as cognitive science itself. It dates at least as far back to Herb Simon and the kind of birth of organizational theory, if not farther back. But this idea is notoriously hard to test. So for decades, it's been hard to translate this idea into any kind of concrete, falsifiable predictions, I think partly because of a lack of methods for studying teams systematically and also a lack of theories at the right level of description. So my research program tries to tackle both of these challenges. Today I'm going to talk to you about the kind of methodological side of things, which is kind of using multiplayer games to study teams and different properties of teams with the kind of precision and volume that cognitive scientists have traditionally used to study individual minds. Now, to make the most of this methodological opportunity, kind of studying teams and multiplayer games, it's also important to think about social behavior across different scales. So at the smallest scale, we can think about how individuals navigate the challenges of collaboration. We can think of this as kind of like a micro scale by analogy to the natural sciences, so much as how particles and forces are the fundamental units of matter. Individual minds and dyadic interactions between them are the fundamental units of social behavior. At the opposite extreme, we can also abstract away from these individual components and look at the aggregate properties of large teams or collectives. So again, by analogy to the natural sciences, we can think of this as kind of a macro scale lens on social behavior. Nowadays, the questions that I'm most interested in lie somewhere in between these extremes. So not just looking at individuals in isolation, nor thinking about crowds as kind of an abstract aggregate, but rather systematically studying how the properties of teams arise from interactions between distinct members. So a kind of mesoscale perspective on social interaction and collaboration. Again, it's hard to, a lot of our traditional methods for studying social behavior are not really particularly well suited for this level of description. Broadly, the existing methods that we have to study kind of large-scale social phenomena like teams and collaboration have kind of like fallen on different ends of this trade-off, where on one extreme, for example, we can look at whole communities in nature, and this lets us look at really rich phenomena like how communities have developed whole technological repertoires over millennia, but our ability to observe these communities is notoriously patchy. So it's hard to trace individual steps in a community's history or who contributed what. This is kind of like a obligate macro scale approach to looking at social behavior. On the opposite extreme, we can also kind of systematically recreate collectives or teams in the lab. This allows us to look at individual behaviors with full information, but because we tend to use simplified tasks, these methods are limited in how long and how complex communities can grow. So my approach, so my work takes kind of a third and complementary approach to try to get a handle on kind of large, complex social phenomena by looking at kind of found data from multiplayer games. So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to tell you about some of my first forays into thinking about kind of mesoscale and more macro scale approaches to collaboration. So I'll talk to you about two projects using kind of a found data set from games, one looking at technological development in communities, and the other looking at the conditions that enable communities to form stable settlements like cities. And towards the end, time permitting, I'll tell you a little bit about how we're planning to bridge these found data sets with more systematic experimental work to build kind of systematic understanding of teams as a kind of like, through a mesoscale theory of social behavior. Okay. So this first project is a collaboration with Charlie Wu, Sam Gershman, and Eric Schultz. A couple of you have seen me present different iterations of this project over the years, and I'm very excited to say this is the first time I can ever put this link up. This work is finally pre-printed after 4 years, so please check it out. But broadly in this project, we look at kind of technological development within kind of a massively multiplayer online game. Technological development is a key part of our success as a species. So humans are really adaptable. Even though we are not particularly strong or swift or sturdy, we've nonetheless developed technologies that have enabled us to adapt to virtually every habitat on Earth. Traditional accounts of how technologies where technologies come from tend to focus on kind of a single level of social organization. So on the one hand, folk tales of how technologies come to be tend to focus on simple stories about brilliant individuals. So Odin discovered the runes, Edison invented the telephone, and so on and so forth. On the opposite extreme, the scientific consensus is that building these technologies is actually anything but an individual activity. Instead, technological developments are best understood as the products of whole communities, and there's a rich, multidisciplinary intellectual tradition trying to kind of understand how communities create conditions that enable technological developments to occur. So for example, work in sociology, economics is focused on the kind of geographical aspects of technological development. So this work has found, for example, that technologies don't happen and kind of isolate in silos. They tend to be concentrated in large cities where people have lots of opportunities to interact with one another. And for example, that putting lots of diverse industries in close proximity tends to promote technological growth. On the other hand, work in kind of cultural evolution, for example, has focused on the demographics of technological development. So this work has found that, I need to cite Ida's work in this slide now. But this work has found, for example, that large and kind of moderately connected communities tend to discover the best solutions to kind of otherwise opaque problems. One common thread that runs through both of these literatures is that often these kinds of macro-level analyses of geographic and demographic characteristics serve as a proxy for the things that we want to know about the individuals who comprise these communities that are difficult to measure directly. For example, we can assume that putting lots of diverse industries in close proximity creates opportunities for people to develop new ideas by interacting with one another and sharing and dividing labor. But it's very hard to test that assumption directly using existing methods. My work tries to get at this challenge by looking at technological development using a different approach, basically by studying large-scale social phenomena using a commercially available video game called 1 Hour One Life. So 1 Hour One Life is a multiplayer online game where players can build complex societies entirely from scratch. Everything that players do in this game happens in a persistent server. So at first, the world of the game looks like this. It's just a boundless expanse of untouched wilderness. But everything that players create in this game gets left behind for future generations. Players can form and live within families in this game, so each time a player starts a new session of the game, their character is born as the infant of another player whose character has reached adulthood. So there's a new player joining now. Note that characters in this game reproduce through parthenogenesis, which means that they have mothers but no fathers. And characters are totally dependent on their parent when they're first born, but they do grow quickly. So characters age by 1 year for every minute that passes in real time, gaining increasing autonomy through childhood, adolescence, and adulthood until they die at the end of 1 hour, which is fairly short relative to real-world lifespans. Actually making it to old age in this game is quite difficult. So most characters starve or get killed, and to survive, you need food, clothing, and shelter, and developing those technologies takes a vast collaboration between whole communities over many generations. So in this game, you can develop new technologies by combining simpler parts. So for example, you can take a short stick and a sharp stone and put them together to make a hatchet. And at first, the technologies that you can build in this game are quite modest, but they do add up. Over time, people have built complex settlements with rich technological repertoires, including kind of agriculture and smithing and domesticated animals and woven clothing, like the one that you see here. Okay, so we obtained a data set of player behavior in this game directly from the game's developer, Jason Rohr. Overall, our sample includes 2,700 communities or family lineages comprised of over 400,000 characters operated by over 22,000 unique players from all over the world. And this data set, I think, offers several advantages that complement existing methods for studying technological development. First, where you're born as a player is largely outside your control. So when you start a new playthrough, you're born to a random family, you're assigned a name by your mother, and you spend your whole life surrounded by other anonymous players who are just visiting the community for up to 1 hour. As experimenters, this is really exciting because we can think of each of these communities at any given time as a kind of ad hoc team that combines players with diverse expertise and learning histories. So this game provides kind of a quasi-experiment into how the changing composition of communities affects their technological growth and decline. Second, the world of the game is much richer than the tasks that we can typically recreate in the lab, so players have access to a boundless map to explore, and they can develop thousands of unique technologies. And maybe because of this, players actually want to play this game. So the most experienced players in our sample have spent over 3,000 hours on this game, which is plenty of time to develop really deep expertise in the world of this game that they can carry on to new communities that they belong to. Finally, in this game, players form communities that are larger and more long-lived than what we can feasibly recreate in laboratory studies. So the median family has kind of 10 family members alive and working together at any given time. And these families can survive continuously for up to 2 weeks, so about 361 hours. Remember that families continue when when one player gets born as the infant of another player, and so that's 361 hours of players kind of working together within the same community around the clock. Okay. So this game provides, oh yeah.
Quick, is there like a goal to the game? Is there like a win condition or anything like that?
Nope.
Don't die?
Don't die. Yeah, it's a multiplayer crafting survival game. So the main objective that people are given is to survive to 1 hour. And that's pretty hard to do because their characters have kind of a hunger meter that depletes continuously over time. So about 60% of characters in our sample starve before they make it that far. But other than that, very little else. Yep.
Just another question about the game. So to what degree do we have any indication from metadata whether people are audited as offline communities participating online?
Oh, yeah, that's a great point.
Because there's lots of reasons to be persistent. One is just curiosity, as you suggest. Another is that I have lots of people and we're talking about and competing over complex discoveries or performance or whatever.
Yeah, so there's a pretty vibrant community of players that spend a lot of time in the game's forums, in the 1 Hour 1 Life subreddit, and that kind of share their experiences playing 1 Hour 1 Life on Twitch and YouTube. That does complicate our interpretation of some of these results. So we can't tell, because they have access to this whole other layer where they can kind of share information about the game with other players. When they make a new technology, we can't really say if they discovered it de novo, or if they were like,
Do you normalize by YouTube views and stuff relative to the technology? It seems like you can very easily incorporate that directly into your model.
Per technology, I think that would be kind of challenging because it's pretty sparse. So when people do, there's pretty much like only a handful of technologies that people actually talk about in these YouTube videos, and they're things like radios, planes, cameras. Those are the things that people tend to feature in videos. So in our analyses, we're trying to get us a broader picture of technological development beyond kind of like, lifting up these like potentially unrepresentative advanced ones. So we haven't really done that yet. I mean, the main way that we've incorporated this is just by constraining our interpretation of what people are doing, and that like when somebody makes a car in this game, we can't really say whether it's a new innovation in the sense of like a lucky accident or a totally new combination. But I think it is comparable to some of the like real world processes involved in establishing an automotive industry, where even if you do have access to the information that you would need to build this through the kind of like metagaming layer, it's not trivial to kind of like build capacity to produce these technologies locally. Yep.
Is the game on Steam?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's on Steam and mobile. They're not paying me to say that. Yeah.
Are many of the, like, what percentage of the communities in the world are at, like, I guess, assume there's some kind of like technological ceiling or something like that was put in by the game developers? Like, do communities frequently get there, or mostly not? Or
I think I answered this question in 2 slides. We can get back to it. Yeah.
I would like to get some clarification. So, if survival is 361 hours, and there are many players,
yeah,
they have to go to sleep, to eat.
Mm-hmm.
Do they pause the game and others continue to play? How does
Oh, yeah. So
how the synchronization works?
Yeah, it's a great question. So individual players can't stay in a community that long because they're kicked out at the end of 1 hour, and they can't completely control where they're placed in next. So this is the family survival. So this is kind of if you draw kind of a family tree of all players who are born to each other over time, and then you measure the latency between the birth of the founding member of a lineage versus the death of the last descendant, that's what this measure is capturing.
Right, but players don't play at the same time. How are they synchronized? Or not, maybe?
Yeah, so I mean, individual players are not, so you can't really pause the game. Like if you go to sleep, then your character would be long dead. Yeah, so this is actually something, I mean, I think this is why, part of the reason why this game is so interesting as kind of a model of large-scale social phenomena is it's hard for one person to stay awake around the clock and to like do all the things that would be necessary to build a city or produce an airplane. So these processes are actually like collaborations that unfold through many players. It's kind of like a relay race over time.
So if the player goes to sleep, the character disappears.
Yeah.
Okay.
They get for every hour anyway.
Yeah, so you don't really occupy, that's also another thing that's kind of unusual about this game is that you don't occupy kind of a consistent player. So you don't have an avatar or a persistent username, or you don't level up. Yeah, each session is completely new. Yep.
And when these players communicate, are they communicating via message, like text, typing it out, or are they also communicating like via Steam, something through a microphone?
So they're not communicating by voice. So this is actually the one thing that we don't have access to in our data set. So it's a limitation of our data. We can see everything that people are interacting with in the game, but they can also communicate to one another by typing in a speech bubble above their heads. Actually, one really interesting thing about this game is that the speech bubble expands by 1 character for every minute that you survive. So infants are typing like single character utterances, and then by the time you're an adult, you can type longer sentences. Yeah, sadly, I mean, we don't really have access to that, but this is something that my lab is currently working on, is doing kind of smaller multiplayer experiments to specifically look at kind of linguistic communication in teams. Yeah.
Is there any conflict in the game?
Yes, so you can, it's not a focus of this project, but about 4% of characters get murdered by another player. So it's, yeah, it's there.
Crime rate.
Yeah, that's the crime rate. Mhm.
Could you clarify? So you said the maximum family survival is 361 hours. I guess the game existed longer than that. So
Yep, it's been running continuously since 2018.
so some players are born into nothing, or how does that work?
Oh, interesting. So there's like some small probability that you get born as an Eve, which is like rather than being born as the infant of somebody else, you're born as a fully, like an adult female in like an uninhabited patch of the map. So if there's nothing available, I mean, basically, yeah, with some small probability, you end up starting a new family instead of joining an existing one. Yeah. Okay, I think I'm going to move on and start showing you some results, but these are great questions. So this game provides a unique opportunity to watch technological developments unfold in a microcosm. So starting from simple, naturally occurring objects, players can develop thousands of unique technologies, including cars, planes, radios, and cameras. This is actually one of the most complex things you can build within this game. And critically, because each individual lifespan is so short, technological developments take the combined effort of whole communities over many generations. So anecdotally, many players can spend their whole lives just trying to make incremental progress on a technology. For example, one player reported, "I spent my life entirely dedicated to taking a picture. We already had a camera, so a huge chunk of the work was already done. I just needed to make some silver nitrate for photographic film, some paper, and a black cloak. By the time the silver nitrate was done, I was an old man. I explained the process to an inquisitive young girl who wanted a picture." Right? So within the context of this game, technological developments are best understood not as the work of lone innovators working in isolation, but rather as a result of this kind of multi-generational collaborative process. This is where I answer Joel's question. Even though the game isn't quite as open-ended as developing technologies in nature, but it still allows a lot of room for communities to grow. So here I'm going to show you a distribution of cumulative repertoire size. So this is the number of unique technologies used at least once by a family at any point through its history, where each unique object counts as a technology. And as you can see, there's a lot of variability in our sample, but there are nearly 4,000 craftable objects in the game, and no one family has interacted with everything yet. I think this also gets at James's question from earlier. Okay, so with these data in hand, we can look at some of the sources of these variabilities. So what are the kind of conditions that enable communities to develop technologies? And we can start by kind of characterizing the roles that each individual plays within these communities. So remember, at any given point, these families are kind of like ad hoc teams of players who have different learning histories and kind of take on different jobs. I was really excited to see Deanna talk about NMF earlier in the week, because we used NMF in our work to kind of characterize what roles or jobs individuals perform within these communities based on the objects that they interacted with. So for this analysis, we started with a simple contingency matrix of 400,000 characters, 4,000 objects, where each cell tells us how often that character interacted with that object. So for example, in this toy example, this character used carrots and hoes, this one interacted with baskets and wild berries, and this one interacted with pies and flour. And then we projected this matrix onto kind of a lower dimensional space of jobs. So NMF gives us kind of an embedding of characters into a lower dimensional space of jobs. This gives us a sense of what jobs people do in any given lifetime, and also decomposes and also a matrix of jobs by objects, which can help us get an intuitive sense of what these dimensions pick out, what objects tend to hang together. And as Deanna mentioned earlier in the week, one benefit of this, of non-negative matrix factorization, is that because of the non-negativity constraint, we can get nice interpretable dimensions from this method. That's also what we find in our results. So I'm going to show you the dimensions that we picked out for a solution with 8 job dimensions and some representative items that kind of load strongly onto each dimension. So the first dimension that we recovered from this analysis loads strongly onto objects like fertile soil, carrots, and hoes. Intuitively, we can think of this dimension as farming. Another dimension loads strongly onto things like pie crusts, hot ovens, and flour. We can think of this dimension as baking. Another dimension loads onto things like baskets, wild berries, and rabbits of all kinds, rabbits in warrens, snared rabbits, dead rabbits. We can call this one maybe foraging, for hunting and foraging. Another loads strongly into things like fleeces and sheep and thread. We can call this one ranching, and so on and so forth. Using this method, we can also pick out jobs that map intuitively onto things like road building and flooring, water carrying, carpentry, and smithing. Okay, so now we can ask, what jobs individuals perform within their communities, and particularly like how individual expertise interacts with the kinds of communities that they're placed in. So for this analysis, we tried to predict this measure of individual adaptation. So this basically picks out how much an individual player's job changed from one lifetime to the next as a function of social influence. So this is a weighted average of all the jobs performed by members in their new community, weighted by the number of interactions between them. And so before flashing this, if players were just doing their own thing, so if they were just kind of like carrying on doing the same activities from place to place, then we might not expect to see kind of an obvious relationship between these things. Or we could expect to see kind of a negative relationship if people are kind of like breaking away from what the rest of the community is doing. But instead we see a kind of like clear positive relationship between the composition of the communities that people are placed in and the jobs that people perform. So overall, whenever individuals are placed into a new community, they tend to take on jobs that are aligned with those of their closest peers. And this model outperforms kind of simpler models that take into account what jobs are most typical across the whole sample, or the average community of the average jobs of the community as a whole, kind of ignoring social interactions between specific players, which suggests that what people are doing is they're, rather than kind of indiscriminately conforming to the rest of the group, they're kind of carving out a niche between themselves and their closest peers. So this gives us a sense of how individuals are shaped by the communities where they're placed. We can also, one nice advantage of this data set is we can also look at this relationship in the opposite direction and ask how communities are shaped by the individuals who spend a little bit of time in them. So for this analysis, we took all the technologies that communities developed within a given time window, and we matched them to technologies that are similarly complex and similarly popular across the whole data set. And we tried to predict, using basically a logistic regression, which technologies would be developed and which wouldn't be developed based on the prior expertise of the player who developed this technology and the expertise of the rest of the community. And overall, we find that communities are more likely to develop technologies that are closer to the expertise of the individual who contributed that technology, but farther from the rest of the community's expertise. So, before we saw that individuals tend to align and perform jobs that are similar to the rest of the community, but they can make the most contributions in areas where their expertise diverges from what the rest of the community is doing. So beyond looking at these things at the individual level, we can also scale up and look at the kinds of consequences of these two processes. So like aligning and concentrating on the same job or diverging to take on different activities. We can look at the consequences of those two processes at the community level. So for this next analysis, we tried to predict effective repertoire size, so the total size of a community's technological repertoire as a function of some kind of aggregate properties of the whole technology. These are all motivated by kind of prior work on the kind of demographic factors that give rise to technological development. So for example, we tried to predict the size of this repertoire based on population size, the number of interactions between community members, specialization. We detected social interactions between players by basically by detecting every event where one character transformed or picked up an object that was put down by another character. The full shape of this graph is massive. We have about 70 million social interactions across the whole data set. Oh, whoops, sorry. I just got a required security update is now available. Pause. Okay. And there are lots of different network characteristics that we could look at in this data set. I'm just going to show you the simplest one, which is just the average number of interactions kind of per capita. So to give you a sense of what this measure picks out, here's a family that has a relatively low number of interactions. Each node is a character, and the opacity of each edge is the number of interactions between them. And here's a community with the same population size and lots more interactions between characters. We also measured specialization using a measure called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, or HHI. This is also called the Simpson's Diversity Index in Ecology. It's basically a measure of what share of the community's activity is concentrated in a particular job. We rescaled this so that intuitively a score of 0 means that the family's activities are kind of evenly distributed across all 8 jobs, and a score of 1 means that a family's activities are totally concentrated in a single job. So again, to give you a sense of what this measure picks out, here's a low specialization family. So, one second. So here, each line is a single character's job embeddings. You can see that these are kind of all over the place. And here's a family with the same population size and high specialization. So this family is almost entirely devoted to foraging. Did you have a question?
I just wanted to make sure I understood the interaction measure. So that's the picking up something that someone else has put down, or that's and so is there a time window over which that I think I just missed this.
Yeah. So we didn't really consider the temporal constraint, but there's a strong spatial constraint in that in order to interact with somebody, you need to be in the same space. But
if someone put something down and then went away and you came along 20 minutes later and picked it up, it wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a measure of sharing. Another way of thinking about it is, a measure of sharing. Yep. Thanks for clarifying that. Okay. So I'm going to show you actually just raw data here. So average effective repertoire size, also average stability, so the proportion of technologies that get carried on from one generation to the next, binned by population size. Overall, we see that, so if we look at the effects of these kinds of community characteristics on these two different indicators of technological development, overall, we see first that kind of the degree to which families specialize in a particular job has different effects on the size and stability of their repertoires. So more specialized communities tend to have smaller but more stable repertoires, and more diverse communities tend to have larger repertoires. They tend to develop more things, but they're also less likely to kind of carry over those new developments onto the next generation. Specialization is the only characteristic that has this property. In general, like bigger communities tend to have more tend to have larger repertoires and more stable repertoires, and communities that share more with one another tend to have larger and more stable repertoires, which suggests that, one second, which suggests that, in order to build kind of a thriving, complex, enduring technological repertoire, families specifically have to kind of like navigate the extent to which they specialize in particular jobs. So they can't just spread out and do as many different things as possible, nor can they focus all of their efforts in a particular job. Instead, they have to balance between the demands of developing technologies and maintaining them in the family's repertoire. Yes?
Sorry, what does it mean for a technology to not be passed down to another generation?
So we discretize family histories into kind of 20-minute bins. And so effective repertoire size is the number of technologies that families used within that bin. And stability is the, if you take kind of like a set of objects that they interacted with in the window, effective repertoire size is the size of that set. And stability is the intersection between that set and the next time window kind of divided by the size of the initial repertoire. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So large and small is the size and not necessarily the structure. So I'm wondering, in the same size groups, what is the difference between the densely connected versus the kind of a little bit more kind of dynamic kind of diversity of expertise?
Yeah. So you can look at this by looking at by looking at these effects along each of these lines. So each of these lines is a kind of, for example, average repertoire size by each bin of population size. So even within kind of a comparable range of population sizes, having more interactions has a positive effect on both the size and stability of repertoires.
But with what structure? You can have the same number of interactions, but with different structures. That's
Oh, yeah, that's right. Here we're focusing on a really simple quality, which is just how often. Yeah, we haven't really looked at. So in this project, we haven't really looked at, for example, like the extent to which families cluster versus kind of like, the extent to which family structures are clustered versus unclustered. Yeah, that's actually, actually, I have some results on that in the next project that are still kind of new, but I can tell you about it when we get to it. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, yes?
I was looking at the poster, and it seems to be an interesting scaling law that, like, where you have a really large population size for the first two graphs, it's like a plateau. And for the stability graph, there's a drop at a certain point. But when the population size is very large.
Yeah.
Sample size.
Yeah, it could be sample size just from kind of like partitioning. Yeah, I think it could just be from kind of like partitioning the data into these smaller bins. But now that, since you mentioned scaling, I am going to kind of talk about that in the next project. Okay. And the last thing I wanted to say about this first project is you can also use these same kind of community indicators to predict whether a community is going to survive. And these kinds of, these different indicators of technological development systematically predict whether population collapse hours before families die out. Again, because players can survive for up to 1 hour, this is kind of several generations before populations bottom out. And this effect holds even after statistically adjusting for the size of these communities or the total number of players who are online throughout the server, which suggests that balancing these different features of communities is not just important for developing technologies and maintaining them, but also important for the kind of continued survival of these teams. Okay. So to sum up so far, 1 Hour 1 Life provides a unique opportunity to study how kind of the changing composition of communities affects their growth and decline. Zooming in at the kind of individual level, we find that individuals adapt their jobs based on the communities where they're placed, and communities add new technologies that are within individuals' kind of unique domain of expertise. At the community level, we see that the division of labor in the aggregate has opposing effects on the size and stability of technological repertoires. and serves as a kind of early indicator of population collapse. Okay. Now, in this next project, we looked at, I think, a complementary but different large-scale social phenomenon, which is what allows these communities to kind of build out into a structured, stable city. The second project is a collaboration with Andrew Steer, who's a postdoc at the Santa Fe Institute and is on the job market this year. This is, I think, this is a small team with kind of high novelty relative to anything that I've worked on before, so I'm particularly excited about this project. Okay, so this project actually was born out because when kind of Andrew contacted me to ask whether the kinds of cities that people build in this game scale in ways that are reminiscent of real-world cities. And so to first give you a sense of where that question is coming from, we know that in the real world, cities scale in very predictable ways. So more populous cities are proportionately denser, more interconnected, more innovative as measured by number of patents, more productive as measured by kind of agricultural and industrial yields. And we can express these relationships more formally as scaling laws. So for example, if we look at the relationship between the log of population size and the log of area, the best fitting line has a slope that less than 1. That's a sublinear scaling relationship. If we plot, say, log of population versus log of number of patents, we would get a slope greater than 1. That's a superlinear scaling relationship. These scaling relationships hold even in archaeological data from ancient societies, which suggests that they're a general property of human settlements and not something that's uniquely enabled by kind of modern infrastructure and technologies. But looking at these scaling laws in 1R, 1 life is a pretty extreme test of this generality. And my hope is that by kind of zooming into what these communities are doing, it can also give us a sense of the kinds of conditions that enable kind of stable cities to form. Okay, so for this analysis, we kind of relaxed the constraint that communities are equal to family lineages. Instead, we use kind of a spatial method to define communities. The procedure we used is similar to the procedure that's used in the real world to define metropolitan statistical areas. So that brought our analysis down to kind of almost 1,500 settlements, which vary wildly in size from just 3 characters to over 8,000. And the first thing that we did is just look at kind of descriptively whether the kind of scaling relationships in these settlements resemble patterns that we've observed in the real world. So here, for example, I'm showing you...
That's 8,000 simultaneous characters?
No, over the course of the family's history, yeah. So here, but yeah, I guess like when we looked at families, like the largest number that we saw at any given time is about 70 if we relax that constraint, the constraint that, so if we also look at interactions between families, it's slightly higher, but yeah. Okay, so first here, I'm gonna show you, the relationship between log of population and log of cumulative degree. This is basically a measure of the total number of social interactions across the settlement. And following kind of divisions from existing theories on urban scaling, we're going to kind of split up these properties. We're going to split up these scaling relationships for kind of smaller communities versus larger ones. In urban scaling, there's also very precise theories for predicting why these scaling laws emerge that are based on statistical mechanics. And these predict that kind of like small settlements should look kind of like amorphous camps, and larger ones should look like more structured network settlements. Okay, and in accordance with, and kind of in alignment with what we see in real world cities, within our data set, more populous settlements are also proportionately more interconnected. They're more productive as measured by kind of total technological complexity, and they're also denser, at least for these larger settlements. There's a really interesting transition that happens between these kinds of small amorphous camps and larger network settlements, and I'll tell you a little bit more about why that societal transition happens. Overall, we looked at several different scaling laws from prior literature, and we compared the kinds of the scaling coefficients that we fit to these virtual cities to both empirical observations of real-world cities and also theoretical estimates of these scaling coefficients derived from first principles. And for nearly every relationship we've tested, we find that these cities are kind of, like relationships that are sublinear in real-world cities tend to be sublinear in the cities that we've observed. So we see qualitative correspondences between scaling relationships in the real world and in this data set. But for many of these, we also see really precise quantitative correspondences. So for many of these relationships, the kinds of scaling laws that we observe in our data set are not just kind of qualitatively similar to real-world cities, but they match the theory and empirical observations in real-world cities in really striking ways. This suggests that, by many of the metrics that we've tested and in alignment with kind of much of the existing theory of these scaling laws, the kinds of cities that people build in this data set look like real-world cities in a really deep sense. Yes?
So I have a clarifying question, sort of based on what James was asking earlier. So normally in like the urban scaling stuff, the population size of the city is like synchronous, like how many people are in the city at one period of time.
Yep.
But if I'm understanding correctly, in this case, the population is aggregated over the life of the community. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we define these communities based on a combination of a spatial constraint and the size of the interaction network. So again, there's a really weak kind of temporal constraint because they just have to kind of interact concurrently with the same spot and physical space. But yeah, so
they're weird cities in that sense. Like a big city can just be like a long column of interactions that's taking place over thousands of years, basically, or in this.
Well, I mean, there is a lot of temporal smoothing that also happens when we empirically measure these properties of real-world cities. Like if we're measuring economic outputs, for example, we're not measuring those instantaneously. We're aggregating over decades. So I don't think the comparison is that different in that sense. Yep.
Are there any like nomadic pastoralist lifestyles where they have like herds of animals that follow over long distances?
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in a couple of slides. Yeah, actually, sorry, now that I think about it, I disagree that the temporal scale is that different. Also, for example, in archaeological data from ancient settlements, when we measure these scaling properties, we're looking at kind of a snapshot of the end state of these communities, or we're kind of smoothing over time. That's pretty similar to what we're doing here, is that when we're kind of like aggregating over a community's history.
And do you have a sense of why the scaling, like the theory that is more predicated on sort of a synchronous analysis extends in those cases? I mean, that's what seems really interesting.
I'm gonna get to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, because I mean, to the extent that we can kind of replicate these scaling relationships in our data set, we can also look at kind of aspects of these theories that are really hard to measure directly in real-world cities. So one thing that's particularly difficult to measure in the real world is what happens in this societal transition. So, what happens when communities build out from these smaller camps into larger settlements? It's also hard to measure the kind of dynamics of this transition, like whether this happens gradually or all at once, just because of the sheer time scale at which these processes happen in the real world. Like I can look at the current population and area of LA today, but I can't hop in a time machine and see how that's changed from pre-colonial times until now. So in some of our newer work, we've been looking at kind of like how the behavior of the people who comprise these communities systematically changes as they undergo these kinds of societal transitions. Again, this starts to get at your question. We started using theories that kind of like explain correspondences or continuities between human communities at different sizes in the real world. So in the real world, we know that life, for example, in these small hunter-gatherer camps tends to look really different from life in kind of a large established settlement. And we can explain the differences between life in these different communities as kinds of different solutions to a common constraint, which is that you need energy. So for example, you need food and you also need to socialize. Yep. So this is not my diagram, but we can express the interaction between these constraints using a relationship like this. So here on the x-axis, I'm showing you population density. And here I'm showing you kind of energy production. So for example, calories produced and social production. So for example, opportunities for social interaction within kind of a small camp in a resource poor environment. One thing that you can see is that, as you increase population density, you have more opportunities to kind of interact with other people and trade stories, build a family, learn from other people. But what you're not doing in these camps when you're all gathered together is that you're not really getting new food. So when these communities are kind of producing new social and cultural products, they're doing so at kind of an energy deficit. And conversely, if you spread out to get food, these communities are producing energy at a kind of social deficit. The way that real-world hunter-gatherer camps kind of navigate this dilemma of social life between social and energy production is that they alternate between two different states, where they gather into camps or they split up to find food. And we call this pattern kind of fission-fusion. This is a pretty consistent mobility pattern that's been observed cross-culturally. On the other hand, the theory predicts that in order to kind of go from this state into becoming a stable settlement, you need to shift either social production by kind of learning to live together or energy production by producing energy in more intensive ways so that you can exist in a state where both of these things are non-negative. And basically, when this condition is met, you can kind of settle down and form a stable settlement. So in kind of ongoing work, we've been looking at whether communities in our data set have to meet a similar condition in order to kind of settle down and form a stable settlement. In particular, this theory would predict that in order to make this transition, communities need to kind of use the space around them in more inventive and intensive ways in order to kind of meet the demands of kind of producing energy for a stable settlement. So we looked at that in our data set by looking at kind of like two features of how people use space. So one is spatial entropy, how many locations people visit, and another is usage entropy, so what people do at these locations. So intuitively, if a community has kind of high spatial entropy but low usage entropy, this is kind of similar to foraging. Like you're visiting lots of different locations and you're getting berries, 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 berries. So you're visiting lots of different locations, but you're not doing, but you're doing just a few things at those locations. On the opposite extreme, if communities have low spatial entropy but high usage entropy, this is kind of similar to working in a kitchen, where rather than going to lots of different places to visit food, you're instead staying within a smaller space, but you're interacting with lots of different tools and resources within that space. And what we find across our data set is that as more populous communities tend to visit fewer locations or use kind of a smaller portion of the space, but they tend to use that space to carry out more diverse tasks. So kind of in alignment with theory, we can see that as people make this transition towards larger, more stable settlements, their behavior also changes in really systematic ways. So they tend to use space in more structured ways. We can also look at the change in these mobility patterns. So going back to Joel's question, we can look at whether individuals within our data set actually move in kind of fission-fusion patterns and how that changes as communities grow out. So for this analysis, we actually kind of estimated the periodicity in people's movements, so how long they kind of spent interacting with things in the wilderness before they kind of interacted with other players. So here I'm showing you the scaling of that kind of interval as a function of population size. And as you can see, as communities are kind of grow out, they also kind of increase the period of this movement to the point that in kind of larger communities, people aren't really kind of periodically fissioning and fusing at all. Instead, they're kind of staying put in the same settlement. Yep.
How do individuals and collectives engage in exploration and exploitation behavior?
Yeah, so I mean, I think within So I think this like fission fusion mobility
So
patterns.
say it's independent, right? That would be objects in the world or tools. That's
Yeah.
the exploration.
Yeah. Right. It's a slightly different feature. I mean, I guess they just kind of do this in slightly different ways. Where, say, if you're living in a small camp, the problem of exploration versus exploitation is you're basically trading off between like trying to visit a new location in order to find a new food patch versus, for example, like waiting for berries to regenerate in a patch that you've already found. So in a smaller camp, that problem looks analogous to the ways that people have typically cast these like foraging problems in experimental tasks. In larger spaces, I think the trade-off is slightly different, where, for example, rather than exploring versus exploiting patches of food, you're instead kind of using the same technologies or the same food sources that you already have versus investing into developing new things. Yeah, so I think it's not really a focus of this project. My hunch is that the form of that problem and the ways that communities solve it should look qualitatively different at communities of different sizes. Yeah.
These findings are really amazing, and it makes me wonder, what is the sort of persistence of physical objects in this space? I wonder if you see some of the things like, Cahokia in North America, where you had this sort of non-permanent or not permanently settled city, but people were gathering from all over the place, so you really had at a sort of larger scale than a sort of hunter-gatherer fission fusion. Do you see things like that? Is that physically possible because of the persistence of objects?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so, first is just factual question. How long do things last?
Yeah.
If I build a building or whatever, does it need to be maintained or does it degrade?
It depends. And usually as communities make this transition, one result that I haven't shown here is they also transition into kind of, they produce different things, like they transition from kind of finding wild foods to domesticated foods. And that shift also affects the duration of things. So for example, in a kind of a small camp, if you build really simple clothing out of straw, it'll decay by itself after about an hour. But if you make woven clothing, that clothing also lasts for longer than the kinds of simpler things. But yeah, in general...
So archaeology, remains of died out communities all over the place?
Yeah, there are. And some players try to exploit this by kind of trying to find ruins and sacking them, basically, especially when they're establishing a new community. Yep. Yeah, I mean, this is also really cool because it allows us to look at how the societal transition happens kind of longitudinally over the course of a community's history. So here, rather than looking at kind of cross-sectional differences between communities, we're looking at kind of how we're looking at kind of the behavior of individuals within these communities over time. And overall, we find that, the mobility patterns that we see in this data set recapitulate theories or kind of align with theories of mobility patterns in real world settlements. So as settlements grow out, their inhabitants kind of stop alternating between gathering to socialize and separating to gather resources. And this transition happens kind of pretty steeply after populations hit a critical point. Okay, I'm kind of out of time, so this is a nice way of testing large-scale social phenomena that would be difficult to look at using traditional methods, and I think it's an important complement to these methods. So just to close out, I just want to say a couple of words about, this is actually really different from most of the rest of my work. I've spent most of my life running much smaller experiments, and so I want to zoom out by talking about kind of how to build this out into kind of a systematic study of large-scale social phenomena by kind of complementing these observational data sets with kind of more systematic experiments. So in general, my lab looks at the kind of interaction between kind of two processes that shape communities and teams. So far we've been looking at kind of top-down kind of structural properties of communities, like population size, the number of interactions, like the density of the interaction network. We can think of these as kind of top-down principles that structure teams. In the long term, I'm also really interested in combining these with kind of a systematic study of how the kind of success of particular structures is also shaped by kind of bottom-up cognitive constraints, like limitations on the attention, memory, and communication of the individuals who reside within these communities. And yeah, my hope is that by combining these methods and looking at social behavior in different scales, we can also find ways to make collaborations smoother, better, more productive. Okay, and this is I spent a lot of time thinking this. So, thanks everyone for listening.